Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. First responders step into the unknown every day, facing chaos, tragedy, things they can't explain. In the dead of night, on lonely roads, or inside the homes of strangers, they've encountered moments that defy logic, moments that linger long after the sirens fade. And what's more haunting, the people they've seen, or the things they've seen. Tonight, we delve into the stories from the men and women who are trained to face anything, yet found themselves questioning everything. Stories of bravery colliding with just pure horror, of choices made in the heat of the moment, not just to save lives, but to protect their own sanity. So, let's get started, shall we? I was a paramedic in the 90s. We had a park where violent crimes weren't exactly a rarity. We were going out there at least once a month, if not more. Most of the calls were roughed up mugging victims, with a few stabbings. Gunshots were rare. One night we were told that someone called to report gunshots and screaming. We had to park behind the police while they cleared the scene. Eventually, dispatch sent us away. Nothing was found. We weren't back at the station for 20 minutes before the next call came in. Same deal, shots and screams. We waited behind the police cruisers, and again, they found nothing. But this time, I talked to one of my cop buddies before we left. She said that they didn't find traces of any activity, let alone a shooting. Even the canines turned up nothing. Both calls came from a payphone in the park, so someone had to have been there. This time, they were all leaving their patrol cars across the street, in view of the phones, to see if anyone returned. We stopped for food on the way to the station, and again, we got the same call a few minutes after getting back. Same deal, only with a bit more head-scratching. The third call also came from the payphone, and the officer on watch didn't see or hear a thing. He swore no one had been to that phone. To make things even weirder, a couple other cops showed up talking about a shooting that they got called there for a few weeks prior. A high school kid was cutting through the park. Two guys had jumped him. He fought back and ended up getting shot. He was already dead when help arrived. That in itself wasn't too weird, but the call to 911 was. The caller said that there had been a shooting, and the shooters ran off. They even described what the guys were wearing. They stayed on the phone until police arrived, but then police never saw the caller. It was assumed that he ran off, might have been the shooter himself. They tried to find him. When the victim's parents listened to the 911 recording, they swore that it was their son, no doubt in their mind. Several friends and family members went on to listen to it, and they all were equally as certain it was the victim. But that makes no sense. Why wouldn't he say that he was shot? That aside, it would have been impossible for him to call anyway. The bullet hit his heart. He would have died before he reached the phone. Now, here we were getting these ghost calls from another young male about another shooting. My whole crew was low-key spooked and ready to leave. We were all on edge back at the station, but we didn't get another call to the park that night. A couple of months went by, and a paramedic from the second shift called to tell me about a possible shooting at the park. He had the same story. They went 4 times that night. Each time was the same. He'd also heard about the boy who was killed and the ghost calls from my shift. There was just no explanation for it. I never really believed in ghosts, but this whole thing made me wonder. I guess I still wonder. It's a hard thing to believe if you're not naturally inclined towards such things. Later that year, I moved away with my fiancé, but I kept in touch with my old crew. On the anniversary of that kid's death, there were 3 more calls. Everyone knew the rumors by then, but they still had to go check it out. Once again, they found nothing and no one. And that was the last time I ever heard about it happening. I'm sure the payphone is long gone by now anyway. Whatever the explanation behind it, whether it's logical or supernatural or whatever word you want to use, I hope that boy is at peace. As a paramedic attached to a fire hall, I've seen a lot of things that no human being should see. Some of the worst were when the ice comes off the river and you go fishing for bodies on the banks. This call was to a multi-vehicle accident. When we got to the scene, it was 2 dump trucks that had rear-ended each other. Simple enough case for me. There was some pretty significant damage done to the truck that had been in the rear. The driver had smacked his head against the windshield, so we went into brain injury and concussion protocols. As I'm holding his C collar, waiting for the backboard, I hear someone saying, "Help, help." I looked at the driver, who was semi-conscious, and asked him who else was in the truck with him. No one, was the answer, but he asked about the other car. I assumed he meant the driver of the truck, and I explained that he would be okay. Then, in very broken English, he spoke Farsi, I learned after. He asked again about the car that he had hit, a small blue car, right in front of him, between the trucks. Alarms went off in my head, and I leaned out the window, screaming that we had another victim. Everyone ran up to me asking if the victim was in the truck. I repeated what the driver told me and heard a lot of "no way" and "you must have heard it wrong." Our battalion chief walked over and he spotted the slightest bit of blue that didn't match the blue on the truck. It was then that we realized this guy was telling the truth. We needed the jaws, a tow truck, and some saws. As I powered through the fiberglass hood of the truck and I reached the engine compartment, we could see the back end of this car underneath the trucks, and then wedged under the front truck above the axle. Then all of us heard the soft, "Help, help," and we went into action. Parts of the truck were flying in every direction, still not fast enough. We pulled the front truck, hoping it would pull the car with it and we could get at it. All it did was pull the car apart. We had stopped hearing the cries for help, so we moved faster. After the car was pulled into 2, I saw an access point through the windshield of the car, which was smashed all to shit, and the roofline collapsed. I needed the grill cut off the truck, and I heard a rush of men and the sound of tools, and the rest of us screaming over it, saying, "Hang on, we'll be right in there." Once the grill was removed, I snaked my way down through the windshield on the passenger side. In my mind, I was thinking that no one could have survived this, but the sounds of help I had heard earlier drove me forward. Nothing in the front seat except the driver's leg, which was still smashing the brake. I saw nothing in the passenger side, so I began to cut into the seat around the springs. All I needed was enough to put my head through, just so I could reassure whoever was in the back seat and hurting that we knew that they were there and we were coming. As I popped through the seat, I wasn't expecting what I saw. Quivering in the small space between the roof and the car and the back seat was a small little black lab puppy. It ran over to me, began licking my face excitedly. I pulled my head back through the seat, stuck my arms in, and began calling for the pup to come to my arms. Eventually, I was able to grab the puppy and pull him out. All of us were still wondering where the help came from, as dogs don't speak, and the driver was dead on impact. Her entire upper body had been sheared off mid-chest. We were all puzzled over that help. Some of us saying the driver was saying help from her upper torso in the truck box. Gory thought, but the human body does weird things. The other favorite theory is that I, and then we, had heard the radio playing. And when we pulled everything apart, we pulled the radio and its power source, the car battery. And that's why the voices stopped. I guess it's the only thing that makes logical sense. Just a little side story. I kept that black lab after she spent her required amount of time in a shelter. She's now a happy, healthy 7-year-old dog whose name is Karma. Back when I was captain in the fire department, we responded to a house fire early in the morning. When we arrived, the roof was breached. The flames had taken out 2 windows on the 2nd floor of a split-level home. We made entry even though the roof was breached. The thermocline was about 2 feet off the 1st floor. We wouldn't have gone in at all, but a child was missing, and the father and the mother had gotten out of the house, but they couldn't get to their daughter's room. The father was treated for burns on his hands and forearms as he had tried to go in after her. Suffice to say, they were frantic. They told us that her room was on the 2nd floor, 2nd door on the right. Simple enough. We made entry, and the stairs faced the door. Rapid bursts from the TFT to the ceiling brought the smoke level up to about 4 feet from the floor. That's when my handline man and I saw something that neither of us could explain. I saw motion to the left, down on the main floor. Someone was walking around downstairs. I pointed to my handline man and he saw it too. We couldn't see a body as the person was in the smoke, but we could see the legs and the feet clearly. It looked to be a man wearing olive green trousers and leather shoes. I wouldn't say that the legs were dancing, but they were certainly moving in a way that got our attention. We redirect back down the stairs and see the legs go into the door on the right side of the small hallway. We both saw the legs go into that room. We get down the hallway and the door is closed. Feeling the door, there weren't flames behind it, and we made entry to discover that we were in the bathroom. The light was on, and curled up in the bathtub was the little girl. There was no one else in the room with her. We broke out the window and got her to a 2nd crew keeping the house next door from catching fire. We looked around the bathroom again and we couldn't find the man that we'd both seen going into the bathroom. There was nowhere for him to hide in there. We withdrew from the house and did exposure control as the house was a complete loss. With the fire already ingressing into the living room, the parents had gone with their daughter to the hospital where she was checked and cleared to go later that morning. The man suffered only 1st and small 2nd-degree burns on his hands and forearms. The family stopped by the station, wanted to thank us for saving their daughter. They asked us how we knew to check the 1st floor bathroom, and I asked them if they knew anything about a man in olive green trousers and leather shoes. The man pulled out his phone. After a minute of thinking, he showed us a picture of 2 old men standing in a lawn. One of the men was clearly wearing olive green trousers and those leather shoes. The man we had seen on the 1st floor had passed away in 1976 and was the man's father. The little girl's grandfather had shown us where she was. We were all pretty speechless. It's the only time I've ever seen a ghost during a response. I've shared my craziest experiences as a firefighter before, but my creepiest, well, I start to think of slightly different call types. One of the ones that stands out was when we were called to do what we call a welfare check. These typically occur when someone is concerned about a family member or a friend who hasn't been answering their phone. or a knock on their door, or perhaps didn't show up for work. We arrived on this welfare check and found a woman with a small child in the driveway. She identified herself as the occupant's daughter-in-law. She'd been trying to reach her husband's mother for a couple of days on the phone, and she wasn't answering. She explained that this was out of the norm and that the woman had health problems and never left the house. We easily popped open the door and entered the house. The TV was on, and in front of it sat an elderly woman, slumped over, quite dead and cold. She'd probably been dead for 12 hours or so. So we started running through the protocol. This included calling the local police department as well as the coroner. We stood in the kitchen talking with the daughter-in-law, getting the patient's name and history, and trying to find out if there was anyone else we should call. As we're talking, I realized that the child she'd had with her in the driveway had entered the house as well. It was a boy, maybe 3 years old. He walked into the living room and was trying to talk to his grandma. He says to Mom, "Grandma's sleeping." He proceeds to sit down on the floor at Grandma's feet and is playing with toys, running his car onto her foot and saying, "Grandma, wake up and play with me." That was sort of sad and creepy at the same time. I wanted to ask Mom to pull him away from her, but he didn't seem disturbed in the least, and suddenly yanking him away from his grandma and keeping him away might scare him. As far as he was concerned, Grandma was just taking a nap. Why not leave it that way? There is a sort of light-hearted ending to this that still makes me chuckle when I think of it. A few minutes later, I see a car pull into the driveway and screech to a halt. An elderly man gets out and heads for the door. The daughter-in-law says, "Oh shit, it's her husband. He doesn't know what's going on." As he comes running into the kitchen and yelling, "What's wrong? What's going on?" I gave him my well-practiced speech. "I'm sorry, sir. Your wife appears to have died several hours ago. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do." He looked at me and replies, "Well, damn it. What am I supposed to do with these drugs from the pharmacy I just got for her?" He holds up the bag. "They cost me $200. I was so stunned I just stood there for a few seconds and said nothing. You're probably thinking, world's biggest asshole, right? It turned out that he and his wife had been separated for something like 10 or 12 years, but since she was in poor health, he had been helping out by picking up groceries and medications from the pharmacy. He said, 'Let me get you boys a cup of coffee.' So that was the scene. Sitting at the kitchen table, my partner and I were drinking a cup of coffee with the widower and the daughter-in-law, while Grandma sat slumped over, dead in front of the TV, with her grandson playing with toys around her feet, waiting for the damned coroner to show up. It was surreal enough for a Salvador Dali painting. I was a medic, off duty at the time, in California, and a car had rear-ended a large truck carrying a load of large metal pipes used for water and storm drainage. Seeing no ambulances in sight, only police, I drove along the emergency lane. I told a police officer that I was a medic, and I showed him my badge. The people in the vehicle were definitely dead. In fact, you couldn't even see their heads. I still checked as best I could to find a pulse. It was procedure, but of course, there was none. Moving on, I helped others who had been hurt in the pileup. Ambulances had finally arrived, and I was about to leave. Yet I noticed several puzzled-looking police officers looking under the tarp that they had placed over the dead bodies in the car, and they were looking around it, under it, everywhere. Curious, I went over and asked what they were doing. They said that they were looking for the head of the driver. The passenger's head was still attached, but barely. I just stood there for a moment looking at the scene, and then it suddenly came to me. I asked the cops to move the car back. They had already had a tow truck in position at the time. I had them stop after there was enough room between the car and the truck, and I climbed onto the hood of the mangled car. Taking my flashlight out, I looked into the pipe, which had struck the driver. My hunch was right. His decapitated head was inside of the pipe and had rolled down about 10 feet. Turning to everyone who was watching me to tell them, I could see that they already knew what I found. Some actually vomited, and others looked faint. I have seen worse over the years, but this is one of those ones that you'll just never forget about. They tell you to leave the job at the station. Don't bring it home. Don't let it fester. I used to think that I was good at that, compartmentalizing, shutting the door on the flames once the hoses were rolled up and the sirens were silent. But lately, the door feels like it's been left ajar. Several months ago, I started having dreams, always the same. Me running through a maze of fire, heat pressing in from all sides, and this screaming. It's not the panicked cry of someone who knows help is on the way. It's hopeless, like she knows no one's coming. I always wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. I never told anyone about the dreams. What's the point? Everyone at the station has their own ghosts. That night, we got the call just past 11 p.m. The old Hargrave Theater was on fire. It had been empty for years, falling apart brick by brick, but someone must have broken in and started the fire. Arson wasn't uncommon in places like that. Kids, homeless people, and some thrill seeker lighting up history just for fun. We rolled up to the wall of flames. The fire was eating its way through the structure like it had a grudge. My lieutenant was barking orders and we got to work. I'd done this 1,000 times before, but something about that night felt off. The fire didn't behave the way fires usually do. It flared up in strange places, burned hotter in some sections than others, like it had a mind of its own. I chalked it up to the building's age. Decaying wood and debris can do that, but it gnawed at me. I was part of the search and rescue team, sweeping the inside for anyone who might have been trapped. The theater was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, rotting seats, and crumbling walls. I was moving fast, clearing each section with precision, but as I pushed deeper, something pulled at my memory. It was the layout. I'd never been in that building before, but I knew where to go. I turned down a hallway without thinking, opened a door that led to a narrow staircase that I couldn't possibly have known existed. In the basement, the smoke was thick, choking, and my flashlight caught flashes of what was left: rusted metal chairs, splintered wooden beams, and a pile of rubble in the corner. And that's when I saw it. A metal box, half buried under charred debris. I don't know why I grabbed it. Something about it felt important. I shoved it into my turncoat and I kept moving. Then I heard it. The scream. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A woman's voice full of terror, coming from somewhere within the basement. I froze. I'd heard the screams before, but this one cut through me like a knife. I shouted, "Fire department, call out!" But there was no answer. I should have stayed and searched. God knows I wanted to, but the ceiling groaned above me. My radio crackled with an order to pull out. The fire was spreading too fast. I ran, the scream echoing in my ears as the floor gave way behind me. We lost one of ours that night, Scott. He'd been on the roof when it collapsed. A good man, gone in an instant. We all took it hard, but I just still couldn't shake the scream. Back at the station, I pulled out the metal box. Inside was a charred journal, its edges brittle and blackened, the handwriting faded but legible enough. It belonged to William Hargrave, the theater's original owner. The entries started innocently, grand plans for the theater, dreams of stardom. But as I read on, the tone darkened. He wrote about an actress, young and ambitious, who threatened to expose him for something he'd done. He didn't name her, but it was clear she had leverage. The final entries were frantic, almost incoherent. He talked about fire as if it were alive, a punishment he couldn't escape. Then the entries stopped. I couldn't stop thinking about her, the actress, the one who disappeared. I started digging into the theater's history, asking questions that seemed to make people uncomfortable. The fire in 1947 that killed several performers was ruled an accident, but there were whispers. Witnesses said that they heard screams in the basement that night, but no bodies were found down there. One night, I visited the ruins. The building was standing just barely. I found the basement again. The air was heavy and stifling, even though the fire was long gone. You know the smell. I stared at the rubble in the corner, and I felt it. Pressure in my chest like someone was screaming without making a sound. I reported everything I found to the authorities. I told them to check the basement for remains, for evidence of what really happened. They said they'd look into it. They didn't. A week later, the theater was torn down. The dreams, they haven't exactly stopped. In fact, sometimes they're worse. The screams are louder, and I can't help but wonder if I left her behind, whoever she was. Maybe she was just a figment of my imagination or a trick of the smoke and my own exhaustion. Maybe she was real, and I'll just never know her name. They tell you to leave the job at the station, but some fires follow you home. I happened to be driving back home in the country region of my home state when I came across an accident that had possibly happened within the last 15 minutes. There was another car parked nearby, so I assumed that they had stopped to help as well. But as I checked the site to triage the victims, I couldn't see anyone else who was checking victims. I had already called for an ambulance and police, and they arrived almost together. I told the cops that there was 1 fatality and 3 injured, and he said that the ambulance guys went to get the injured out first. As I was helping them extract 1 injured girl from her car, I noticed the door was open on the front passenger side, but no one was in the seat. The seatbelt had been cut away. I looked to see if there was a trail, and I could see traces of blood heading away from the car. I told one of the cops, and we started to follow the trail. As we ran along, we could hear a girl crying out, so we knew she was injured. She'd probably run away in shock. We finally broke through the bushes into a small clearing and stopped. We couldn't believe what was happening. There were 2 men with her, and they were trying to get her clothes off. But she still had enough strength to resist them. As the cop called out for them to stop, I ran forward and punched the person nearest to me with a very hard punch to the side of his head. He went down and didn't move as I turned to the second one, but the cop had already had him and was calling for backup. As he went to get the one that I'd punched, I asked him if I could get a minute alone with the other one, who was now in handcuffs. He looked at me with a real serious look, told me that he could do in 15 seconds with his truncheon what I could do with him in a minute. I left it to him and went to the girl who was shivering and sobbing in shock. I gave her my jacket to wear. Other cops arrived and grabbed the 2 men and dragged them away. I stayed with the girl until the paramedics arrived. As I made my way back to the accident site, I could hear the satisfying sound of the 2 men crying out. I've been a firefighter for nearly 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of things that would make most people never sleep again. But nothing, not even the worst infernos I've ever faced, could prepare me for what happened on this night. The call came in around 2 a.m. An old warehouse in the industrial district was ablaze. By the time we arrived, the fire had already consumed most of the structure. Captain split us into 2 teams to search for any squatters who might have been trapped inside. I was paired with Martinez, but as we made our way through the thick smoke, a beam collapsed between us, cutting me off. I radioed in, but the static drowned out any response. Somehow, my radio was busted. I tried doubling back, but the fire had grown way too intense. The air was scorching. My visibility was practically zero. I knew that I was in trouble. Then, through the roar of flames, I heard a voice. "Over here." It was faint but insistent, cutting through the chaos like my actual lifeline. I turned and I saw a figure in turnout gear just ahead of me, illuminated by the flickering fire. Thank God. I was stumbling towards them, telling them, "I'm stuck, lead me out." The figure didn't respond, but motioned for me to follow. I didn't question it, I was too focused on surviving. We weaved through the maze of debris, ducking under falling beams, skirting walls of flames. I kept calling out, trying to get a name or confirmation of who it was, but they stayed silent. Finally, we reached a clear exit. The figure stopped, turned to look at me, and then simply walked into the smoke, disappearing. I stumbled out into the cold night air, half expecting to see the figure that had led me to safety. I was coughing and gasping as my team rushed over. "Jesus, we thought we lost you," Martinez said to me, grabbing my shoulder. He asked, "Where the hell were you?" "I got separated," I said. "One of you guys found me and led me out." The team exchanged confused glances. My captain stepped forward. "I don't know what you're talking about. We've all been outside. No one went back in after the collapse." I froze and my mind was racing, replaying every step, every detail. I was certain that I'd followed someone. The turnout gear, the voice, it was all real, wasn't it? Later that night, as I lay awake in the station bunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been saved by something or someone not of this world. I don't know if it was a ghost, a guardian angel, or something else entirely. I don't think I'll ever know. What I do know is I shouldn't have made it out of that fire alive, but I did. And it wasn't by my own doing. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Mary H, Tanya F, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Tony P, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.